When she was launched on April 10, 1912, the RMS Titanic represented the pinnacle of human engineering achievement. She was the largest, most luxurious ocean liner ever built, and with her double-hulled bottom and 15 watertight compartments running the length of the ship, she was deemed practically unsinkable. Titanic set out from the port of South Hampton, England on her maiden voyage to New York City with 2,224 souls on board, including a crew of nearly 700 under the command of Edward J. Smith, one of the world's most seasoned ship captains. Among her passengers and crew were some of the wealthiest and most influential business magnates and social elites of both the Old and New worlds. But just 4 days later, at 11:40 p.m. on April 14th, in the deep, frigid waters of the North Atlantic, Titanic struck an iceberg with what at first seemed like a glancing, superficial blow of her starboard bow. Many passengers actually slept through the impact. Those who were aware of it didn't feel like there was anything to be concerned about. Titanic was supposed to be unsinkable after all, and there were no immediate signs of danger. The first person to realize the gravity of the situation and the fact that Titanic would never reach her ultimate destination after all was the man who built her, Thomas Andrews. As Andrews explained to Captain Smith, the impact with the iceberg had opened up 5 of the ship's forward watertight compartments to the sea. Titanic could remain afloat with only 4 of these compartments breached. It would take time, 2 hours or so by Andrews' calculations, but the pride of the White Star Line was doomed. At 2:20 a.m., Titanic slipped beneath the waves and fell to the bottom of the sea. Of her 2,224 passengers and crew, only 710 survived, owing to a lack of sufficient lifeboat capacity and the frigid temperatures of the northern Atlantic. The wreck itself was lost for 73 years before finally being located 425 miles off the coast of Newfoundland at a depth of approximately 12,500 feet. What began as a triumph of the human spirit has since become synonymous with our conception of tragedy. Nearly 112 years have passed, but the story of Titanic and her fateful maiden voyage continue to fascinate us. The testimonies of the survivors and the images brought to us from the ocean depths, where the bulk of this once great ship of dreams lies battered and broken, are both alluring and haunting. Many have risked their lives, and a few have even paid the ultimate price to risk journeying in person into the dark, cold, and crushing depths where Titanic lies fading in her grave like a mournful ghost. Why is it that she still beckons us? What is it about this tragedy, now so distant in time, that continues to grip our imaginations? In this video, we'll explore some of these questions, and courtesy of Walter Lord, one of the foremost scholars of the Titanic tragedy, perhaps gain some insight into why April 15, 1912 will always be a night to remember. Hello and welcome, or welcome back, as the case may be, to the Atlantean Archive. Today I'm delving into the first nonfiction subject that I've talked about on this channel, and that, of course, if you've already clicked on this video, you know will be the sinking of the RMS Titanic. Now, I've been fascinated with history, various facets of history all of my life, and I've probably read more in historical subjects than I have in anything else, including all the fiction I've read over the years. And when I was a kid, growing up in the 70s and 80s, one of the things I was most fascinated with was the story of the Titanic. I remember watching the famous movie that was made back in the 50s, A Night to Remember. I remember watching that with my mom, and she had some knowledge of that from people that she had talked about growing up with. So that was a fascinating subject to me. And if you were a kid back then and you wanted to learn anything about this subject, there was one resource that you were directed to. There were many books that had been written on it already by then, but there was one that was consistently recommended above everything else, and that was Walter Lord's book, A Night to Remember. This was published in 1955. The version that I have here is from 1997. This was released, I'm sure, to coincide with James Cameron's Titanic film, which, of course, became one of the highest grossing movies of all time. Now, this book I bought just to have a better reading copy of it. My original, which still has sentimental value to me, is this one from 1977. And it's about as beat up now as the Titanic herself is these days. So it's kind of fallen apart. It's been taped up there on the spine and all that sort of thing. But It has sentimental value to me again, so I continue to hold on to it. Some of you will know what that's like to have an attachment to a particular book, especially if it's written on something that is of real interest to you. And this one here actually says Special Book Club Edition. For those of you who remember the old Scholastic book services, where at school they would pass around the old order forms and you could order whatever you want. That was actually my favorite thing about school in those days. This was always on the top of the list recommended for students. There were certain books you saw all the time back then, elementary, upper elementary, junior high school levels, books that kids were always doing reports on, that sort of thing. There were always titles that kept resurfacing. You got stuff like Bridge to Terabithia, Where the Red Fern Grows, Old Yeller. A lot of kids were into The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, and this was one of the other ones that you would see on somebody's desk when book report time came due. I remember that distinctly. And I first read it back then and really engaged with it. This is one of the things that has made this book so special to me. This was probably the first history book that I read or a book I should say, written on a historical subject that really got me engaged with the subject. Walter Lord's writing his writing style in the book is really excellent. And specifically in the way that he brings the Titanic's passengers and crew to life. He writes the book mainly as a series of vignettes. He jumping from one person to another, passengers and crew alike. And he'll give you a little snippet about a person, tell you maybe a little bit about their life, what's going on with them, and he'll tell you where they were when something happened, how they reacted to it. Lord says that he embellished nothing from all of the accounts that he received of the sinking of the ship. And he did talk to, I think about 62 of the Titanic's survivors. So he got firsthand stories from them, or I should say back then he probably corresponded mostly with them. And he himself grew up with a fascination, started collecting Titanic memorabilia from a young age and that sort of thing. So he went to efforts to be meticulous about his documentation here. He's not inventing anything. He tells you that if he records a conversation in this book, then that is what was given to him. So, he doesn't do the speech of Pericles to you or anything like that in this book. This is as close as you're going to get to an authentic experience, what it was like to be on the ship that night. I'll give you a real quick example of it just because I do highly recommend this book. And I do think, again, that this really helps bring things out in a way that will engage with you more. If you typically find history reading to be dry, mundane, this is a little bit different, and I encourage you to give it a try. This right here from the beginning of the book, right after the strike on the iceberg, Mr. and Mrs. George A. Harder, a young honeymoon couple down in cabin E50, were still awake when they heard a dull thump. Then they felt the ship quiver, and there was, quote, a sort of rumbling, scraping noise, unquote, along the ship's side. Mr. Harder hopped out of bed and ran to the porthole. As he looked through the glass, he saw a wall of ice glide by. The same thing happened to James B. McGough, a gimbals buyer from Philadelphia, except his experience was somewhat more disturbing. His porthole was open, and as the berg brushed by, chunks of ice fell into the cabin. So you get things like that over and over again in this book. Just, again, hopping back and forth, giving you perspectives from various people, what they recall, what they said to one another. As a matter of fact, he translates that into the chapter titles, which are really interesting. You get things like chapter 2, there's talk of an iceberg, ma'am. 3, God himself could not sink this ship. 4, you go and I'll stay a while. 5, I believe she's gone, Hardy. And then others, we're going north like hell. And go away, we have just seen our husbands drown. Those are the chapter titles that you get. And he lifts them right from the experience of the people, what they said, what they were talking about that night, their impressions. And again, it makes for a really engaging read, really brings these people to life, really gets you to the point where you can step into their shoes and sort of come close to experiencing what they experienced. And in the course of the book, of course, humans, we respond to tragedy, we respond to trial, to emergency situations in different ways. Some people are more anxious than others. They're going to immediately want all the answers they can get. They're going to hunt everybody down till they get a satisfactory answer. Other people, they have more confidence. They're more laid back, or they're just not concerned about it. And you get all of that in this story, just a cross-section of humanity and how people respond to it, both the passengers and the crew. Some are worried, some are not. A lot of people actually slept through the scrape with the iceberg. Other people, they felt something. They felt a jarring, a shaking, a rumbling, and then they go, oh, probably nothing. Went back to sleep. Other people, they get up, they get dressed, they go out on deck. They want to know what's going on. And one of the more remarkable things about this tragedy is, and it really is the first modern tragedy in a lot of ways. I think it's justifiable to say that, and I'll go into that a little bit more. But one of the interesting things about this is how slowly people reacted overall throughout the ship. Of course, you don't have some kind of ship-wide intercom or anything back then, and the crew, the captain, his officers, they don't want to panic the crew. They don't want to panic the passengers. So they're trying to keep a lid on things until they know what's going on. And even then, once they do find out, hey, Titanic's not going to make it. And they found out within about 20 minutes. Thomas Andrews, who was the Titanic's builder, was on board for the maiden voyage. And he went down and inspected the damage for himself firsthand. And he could tell, as I go into in the introduction, that at least the first 5 of Titanic's watertight compartments had been breached. And Titanic could only stay afloat with 4 compartments breached. And another thing about the ship, as again I mentioned in the introduction, it has all these watertight compartments running the entire length of the ship, but they don't go up high enough. So when the water fills one compartment in the bow and weights it down, then it goes over the top of the watertight compartment next to it, then that one fills up, and it just continues to spill over, and it pulls the ship down gradually. And there's a point beyond which it can't tolerate the stress, and that's exactly what happened in the case of Titanic. It just filled too much. It couldn't handle that. And Thomas Andrews realized it's just going to continue to fill at this point. We can't hold it back. Not even the pumps are going to be able to help us. She's going down. And he factors in probably a couple of hours, and he was pretty much right on the money with that. Titanic hit the iceberg at 11:40. She sank at 2:20. So he's telling all this to Captain Smith, and then Smith has to figure out what to do. And then still you have people who are reluctant to get on board with it. Then you have other members of the crew even who get the news very slowly. There was one of the crew members, I think he was a quartermaster, who was doing his rounds on the stern of the ship an hour after the Titanic hit the iceberg, and he happens to see a lifeboat go floating by. And he's got no clue what's going on. So he calls up the bridge and says, what the heck? And they basically answer, what the heck? You don't know what's going on here? And he was the guy actually that got to come forward with the signal rockets to fire off the distress signals to any ships that might be in the area. So it's fascinating to see how people responded to this, how slowly the news spread, and then how people were reluctant to take it seriously. Titanic had this reputation. She was supposed to be virtually unsinkable. So people are like, well, no, surely not. And you get a situation where some people are like, okay, we'll get into the lifeboats. It'll be an exercise. Then after they've got the situation under control, they'll just bring us back. You know, this is a precaution. So you've literally got passengers being loaded into the lifeboats thinking this. And some of the men, of course, you had a women and children first situation. So some of the men, when they were trying to get their wives and kids onto the lifeboats and their wives didn't want to leave them, they would tell them something like, I'm sure it's just a formality. It's just a precaution. We'll all be back together soon. They're going to send you out there and then they'll bring you back. And of course, that doesn't happen. So you had a lot of reluctance to accept what was going on. And Lord goes into that and gives that description again, hopping from perspective to perspective, really, really well. And as I mentioned at the very beginning there, in the introduction to the video, there's so much about the Titanic tragedy that has caused it to be compelling. And why we're still talking about it after all these years. Why are we so fascinated? You know, all the movies that have come out about it, and James Cameron's blockbuster, but there have been others made even since then. And, why are people taking submersible trips down to see the Titanic? Why do we keep talking about this? Why does it stand out so much to us? Part of it, I think, is in the stories of the survivors, how compelling they are, how much they bring the situation to life. But there's so much about the incident with the iceberg itself, how everything happened, how the situation developed, that is so strange that it continues to bring us back in an effort to understand it. For one thing, as Walter Lord goes into in the book, and as others have talked about endlessly, It was absolutely a perfect situation, a perfect scenario to sink the ship. As a matter of fact, if you had appointed a committee and told this committee, hey, bring together all of the circumstances that you possibly can to sink the Titanic, I don't know that they could have done a better job. You've got unusual ice in the area. For that time of year, all these ice floes. There were other ships that were actually stopping in the region. There was one, the Californian, which played a role in this disaster, which was actually close enough to have come and rescued the Titanic's crew, probably got everybody off. But they were stopped dead because of the ice, and probably also because their captain wasn't very experienced with that. He didn't want to take a risk. He just stopped his ship out there. So you have all this unusual ice activity. And then this was a moonless night. So you've got very dim lighting conditions. It's more difficult for Titanic's lookouts to spot the iceberg. And then people have reflected often on just how calm the ocean was that night. Some said they had never seen it like that before. They said it was like the surface of a mill pond or like a sea of glass. It was absolutely still, unbelievably still. So that also made it difficult to spot the iceberg, because in that case, you don't have the waves breaking and foaming against the base of the iceberg. That's another thing that made it difficult to spot. And then some people have speculated that from the descriptions that were given, that this may be what they called a blackberg, a darker colored iceberg. Or it could be a situation where, as everybody's heard the phrase, tip of the iceberg, you know that only about a tenth of the iceberg is actually out of the water. Most of it is below the water. Every once in a while, as the iceberg melts, things will shift enough, its center of gravity will shift enough that the iceberg will actually flip in the water. So the part that's been exposed to the elements, that's crystallized, that's got that real hard white, icy white color, that's below the surface. And you get the part that's been submerged for so long, which is more translucent and much more difficult to spot. Now you've got that above the waterline. So there are some people thinking that that may be what happened. But it was absolutely the most difficult circumstances you can imagine for people using the technology of that day to spot and avoid an iceberg. So you had that happen there. And then you had various ice warnings that Titanic pretty much ignored, and we're not even sure how many of them exactly got to the bridge. The Californian, the ship I mentioned earlier, as being close by and stopped due to the ice, their radio operator, their wireless guy, tried contacting the Titanic to warn him about the ice in the area. And as it turns out, Titanic's wireless operator was pulling his hair out, because back then the Marconi sets, as they call them, the wireless radio sets that they had for communicating with anybody on shore and for other ships, the passengers were so enamored with that new system that they're just all wanting to send these personal messages out to everybody that they can think of and get their response. You know, it's the new thing that everybody wants to do. So this guy is swamped with all of these kinds of things. And he literally tells the Californian, shut up. And the California's radio operator, he's like, well, fine, be that way. He gets mad. He shuts off his radio set for the night and actually goes to bed. Nobody else on his ship even knows how to operate the thing. So later on, when Titanic hits the iceberg and starts sending out the QCD, I think it was, distress call, the distress signal that they used in those days, now California, even though it's close nearby, just they're not picking up anything. And again, I mentioned that this was the first modern disaster in that you have this technology involved in it. Titanic's signal was able to reach other ships. Her sister ship, the Olympic, for instance, was, I think, roughly 500 miles away. She got the message and started toward that location. You've got others. The Carpathia was another ship. This was the one that ultimately did rescue the Titanic's passengers and crew, what was left of them by that time, even though she didn't arrive for over 4 hours. She arrived with dawn. And of course, by then it was too late for most of the people who had gone into the water. But she picked up the signal and started moving north. Other ships tried to respond to it. You've got radio operators on the land who are responding, but nobody can do anything. And that's one of the interesting elements about the tragedy. Titanic's able to reach out in real time. For the first time in history, you've got people responding in real time to a disaster, but they can't do anything about it. They can't get there fast enough. And I'm reminded of how similar this is to the recent Titan submersible situation that happened. You know, the guys who went down in the submersible to visit the Titanic and the thing imploded, which is actually the first time that's happened. It's the first loss of life we've had like that on a deep sea submersible, which is rather remarkable. But they were in sort of a similar situation, or so we thought at first. You know, when their support ship lost contact with them, we were told things like they had 96 hours of air on board, that sort of thing. And it was all in the news. Everybody was kind of glued to the situation. Are they going to be able to find these guys? But even if we could find them, nobody's ever done search and rescue at those depths. So we're like, if we can find them there, what do we do about it? They're just going to stay down there and basically run out of air and die. Of course, we know the implosion happened, and the U.S. Navy actually knew that pretty much right away and didn't tell anybody, so the drama kind of stretched on for a couple of days. But it's eerie how similar that is to what happened with the Titanic, when you've got the distress call going out, but you can't get anybody there to do anything about it. So you had that element involved with it as well. Again, just the strangest of circumstances that played into this disaster and continue to draw people back to it, thinking, what could have happened? And then you have the fact that the Titanic doesn't have enough lifeboats for everybody on board. And amazingly enough, back then, that was not mandated. And when people were accosting the White Star Line, the owners of the Titanic, after the tragedy, they were bringing this up. But Titanic, oddly enough, had more lifeboats than were actually required by the regulations of that day. She had enough, I think, for 52% of everybody on board. Still not enough, but White Star was like, hey, we went over and above what we actually had to do. So a number of things came out of this, came out of the tragedy. That was one of the things that changed right away, is that lifeboat capacity had to be matched to however many passengers and crew you had on the ship. The U.S. and Britain started an international ice patrol. This was also the first modern disaster, if you want to think of it that way, in that it was the first time the SOS was actually used as a distress call. The Titanic's wireless operator was sending out the QCD signal that had been used up until then, and then Captain Smith comes in and tells him, hey, you might want to change over to SOS. This has just been approved by an international committee. Apparently, it was felt that SOS was a simple enough signal for even amateur radio operators to pick up, so they wanted to go over to that. And so you've got the first SOS distress call in history. And then there are other aspects of this as well. People have pointed out that there was the class distinctions that you had. This was still Titanic. The atmosphere, the culture of the age was still very much a product of the Gilded Age, an age of where wealth and privilege were the celebrated aspects. And that was another aspect of the Titanic voyage itself. There were so many wealthy, famous people on board. J. Bruce Ismay, the owner of the White Star Line, he was on board. He actually survived the sinking. He came under a lot of fire for that in years afterwards. People told him, well, like Captain Smith, you should have gone down with the ship. And he's been accused of cowardice in that situation. But you had your first class, you had your second class passengers, and then you had your third class or steerage passengers. These are the poorer people. These are the immigrants trying to move and start a new life for themselves in the new world. And people have pointed out since then that a disproportionate number of third class steerage passengers were lost as compared to first and second class. And Walter Lord goes into that. The statistics suggest who they were. The Titanic's casualty list included 4 of 143 first-class women, 3 by choice. So of 143 first-class women on board the ship, all of them were saved except for 4 of them. 15 of 93 second-class women survived, 81 out of 179 third-class women. Not to mention the children. Except for Lorraine Allison, all 29 first and second class children were saved, but only 23 out of 76 steerage children were saved. And there's been people over the years have speculated, did they deliberately try to stop the third class from getting to the lifeboats, from getting up on deck? People have gone back and forth on that issue. Walter Lord goes into it a little bit here. You have situations where somebody would stop someone trying to go into the first class area and tell them, no, your boats are down on that end, you go that way. In fairness to the White Star Line, Walter Lord says, these distinctions grew not so much from set policy as from no policy at all. At some points, the crew barred the way to the boat deck. At others, they opened the gates but didn't tell anyone. At a few points, there were well-meaning efforts to guide the steerage up, but generally third class was left to shift for itself. A few more enterprising met the challenge, but most milled helplessly about their quarters, ignored, neglected, forgotten. If the White Star Line was indifferent, so was everybody else. No one seemed to care about third class, neither the press, the official inquiries, nor even the third class passengers themselves. In covering the Titanic, few reporters bothered to ask the third-class passengers anything. The New York Times was justly proud of the way it handled the disaster, yet the famous issue covering Carpathia's arrival in New York contained only 2 interviews with third-class passengers. This apparently was par for the course. Of 43 survivor accounts in the New York Herald, 2 again were steerage experiences. You had some other issues too that came up on it. Walter Lord talks about how the sinking of the Titanic was really that end of that era of wealth and privilege, and he goes into that in a few ways that are especially striking with the Titanic disaster. With this lost world went some of its prejudices, especially a firm and loudly voiced opinion of the superiority of Anglo-Saxon courage. To the survivors, all stowaways in the lifeboats were Chinese or Japanese. All who jumped from the deck were Armenians and Frenchmen or Italians. And there were various men passengers, declared Stuart Crowe at the U.S. inquiry, probably Italians or some foreign nationality other than English or American, who attempted to rush the boats. Stuart Crowe, of course, never heard the culprits speak and had no way of knowing who they were. At the inquiry, things finally grew so bad that the Italian ambassador demanded and got an apology from Fifth Officer Lowe for using Italian as a sort of synonym for coward. So you had a lot of that going on. And it's just interesting how the class distinctions and the prejudice of the day played into all of those things. So another part of the Titanic tragedy, again, so many lost. The lifeboats were only filled to partial capacity. Any of those who have seen James Cameron's movie, even if you don't know much about the disaster, you know they hardly put anybody in the lifeboats compared to their capacity. There were only a few that actually got filled all the way. And that was another part of the drama. You know, another part of how did people handle all of this? Even in the lifeboats, you see that cross-section of humanity in that disaster response. You had some people who were very gallant. The unsinkable Molly Brown, who was trying to get her lifeboat to turn back and pick up other passengers who were in the water after the sinking of the ship. And the Titanic crew member who was in charge of her boat didn't want to do that because he was afraid of getting the boat swamped. So you've got people on the one hand saying, we need to go back and save those people in the water. They're drowning. We can hear them. And there were passengers who are survivors of the incident who for years after were haunted by these. There was one guy who ended up living near a stadium and ended up having to move because every time the cheers of the crowd rose up in the stadium, he was reminded, he said, of the screaming of the people in the water after the ship sank. So you have that, all of these issues that are kind of gray. Do we go back? Do we risk getting swamped and killing the people in the lifeboats? But how can we listen to these people crying out there at the same time? And then you had incidents where like one man asked another if he could borrow his hat just to warm his head up a little bit. And the guy's like, no, what do I do? Well, what am I going to do after that? So you have courage and cowardliness, even in the last moments when the ship is sinking, although people had behaved themselves really rather well up until that time. Then you've got that last minute desperation, some fights breaking out, that sort of thing. Just overall strangeness about all of this entire situation. Again, I linked in the Titan disaster there. And then many of you will also know, which is odd when you consider the name Titan, Titanic. Walter Lord starts off the book by talking about another very strange synchronicity, a very strange similarity that I'll just read real quick for you here because it's really rather short and it's an intriguing part of the puzzle. In 1898, a struggling author named Morgan Robertson concocted a novel about a famous Atlantic liner, far larger than any that had ever been built. Robertson loaded his ship with rich and complacent people and then wrecked it one cold April night on an iceberg. This somehow showed the futility of everything, and in fact the book was called Futility when it appeared that year, published by the firm of M.F. Mansfield. 14 years later, a British shipping company named the White Star Line built a steamer, remarkably like the one in Robertson's novel. The new liner was 66,000 tons displacement. Robertson's was 70,000. The real ship was 882.5 feet long. The fictional one was 800 feet. Both vessels were triple screw and could make 24 to 25 knots. Both could carry about 3,000 people, and both had enough lifeboats for only a fraction of this number. But then this didn't seem to matter because both were labeled unsinkable. So he brings in the famous Titan from the novel Futility, which I really need to read someday and just see how similar it actually is. People have pointed out there are also some remarkable differences, but still, when you consider everything that happened, and the sinking of the ship, just how it all came together, and then how so many lives were lost, and then the Titan tragedy that's recent, and then this book that was written a few years before the Titanic sank, where you have so many similarities. The whole thing is just eerie when you look at it that way. And that's a strong aspect of what's so compelling. It brings us back to this. And then you have Titanic herself, this marvelous, magnificent, beautiful ship where everything was brand new and was unlike anything else. Walter Lord quotes a man who served on the Olympic, on both Titanic and Olympic apparently. And he mentions that there would never be another ship like her. Olympic was a sister ship, very similar in a lot of ways. But he says Titanic was just so much more opulent, so much more beautiful. And now she lies at the bottom of the sea, broken in two pieces, so slowly giving way to the ravages of time and a particular type of bacteria that is literally eating her alive and is just forming these, what they call rusticles. The ship is just covered in these things. You can see them in the famous footage of the wreck and some of what I showed earlier. Titanic, in many ways, her story, and as beautiful as she was, as grand as she was, it seems almost like the story of a bride who's killed on her wedding day heading to the church, dressed up in all of her finery. And now she's left in this deplorable condition, a dream that just perished in the most tragic way possible, taking so many lives with her. Titanic at that time, of course, one of the greatest maritime tragedies ever. So many died on that ship who were just seeking to start a new life in the new world. Of course, you had your opulent passengers, your famous people who were wanting to take part of her luxuries, but so many others just boarded her to start a new life. And there were even some cases of premonitions about what happened. Eva Hart, many of you will have heard interviews with her. She was one of the Titanic survivors who was most frequently interviewed over the years. She said her mother had a premonition about it, and she would not go to sleep at night on that ship. She sat up fully dressed, so when the hit on the iceberg happened and the call to the lifeboats went out, she was not a bit surprised. So all of these factors. Walter Lord wrote a follow-up in the 90s, The Night Lives On. This book is, not, in my opinion, not as good as the original. It's not as engaging, but still worth your time delving into the legacy of Titanic. I have several books on it. Charles Pellegrino's The Sinking of the Titanic, which I have, but I couldn't find. That's another one you might want to check out. It's a pretty good book on that. And then I have this monster here. This is an Titanic, an illustrated history. This got a little bit messed up in the move to our house that we're currently in now, but all kinds of great stuff in this one. Lots of history, lots of photos. Again, going into the design of the Titanic, how she was built for just unmatched in her luxury, and at that time, the technology that went into it, the safety that went into it, because we know everything, of course, now that went wrong with it. But at the time, she was a first-class vessel. She was considered very safe. And of course, then you have the discovery in 1985 there by Dr. Robert Ballard and the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute. I remember very well when the Titanic wreck was finally located. I was 12 years old at the time, and it was big news. We got to see a few images. It was absolutely fascinating, because everything I had seen up until then, everybody had always emphasized, that she is like a ghost ship, because we've never been able to find her. Efforts had been made. Some had even talked about trying to raise her, which was always a pipe dream from the very beginning. You might find a way to preserve the wreck, at least the bow section. The stern is completely destroyed, just based on the way that they sank. But now anybody who tried to raise the Titanic, even the bow section, which is much more intact than the stern, it would just fall apart on you. So all of that is a pipe dream. But the RMS Titanic Inc., the official caregivers of the wreck, have recovered quite a few items, including pieces of the hull, which you can find on display in various places if you want to look that up. I need to make it out to one of those exhibitions at some point. Again, this has been an issue I've been fascinated with my whole life. So, highly recommend this book. I've probably gone on longer than you wanted me to. But these are some of the things that I personally find fascinating about Titanic, about its legacy, about what actually happened that night, and in particular why I recommend Walter Lord's seminal book on the issue. So, A Night to Remember. Yes, it always will be. And this is a book to remember for anybody who's interested in that subject. So thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed this, please like the video. Please consider subscribing to the channel and sharing any of the content that I have here. And until next time, thank you very much, and God bless.
There wasn't any panic until the lifeboats left, and then there was panic galore. We were down on the ocean. We could hear them running about on the decks and screaming. You can imagine people came up from their cabin, went onto the deck, no lifeboat, tearing around the other side. That's when the panic was there. There wasn't any panic at the time I got in the lifeboat because there weren't enough people up there. And there were enough people there to just get into the lifeboats. But after that, when the others started coming up from their cabins and there were no boats, gosh, there was panic. We could hear it. Definitely. But the most dreadful sound of all is the sound of people drowning. The screams. Absolutely ghastly. My mother used to say sometimes, she couldn't get me to talk about it for years, but if ever anyone did talk to me and I said that, she used to say yes. But do you remember the silence that followed it? And that's quite right. It says the whole world stood still that night. Once the lights had gone, the ship had gone, the sound had gone. Oh, it was dreadful.